I want to welcome you to the Wednesday service for April 22nd here at Bakersfield Free Will Baptist Church. And we are going to continue in the study in the book of Acts. And today we're actually in Acts chapter 10. And I'd like to begin reading in verse 1, Acts chapter 10 and verse 1. And actually we're going to try to talk about the entire chapter of Acts chapter 10. We may not read all of the verses, but I do want to read some of them. So notice with me, if you will, Acts chapter 10 and verse 1. There was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. He was a devout man and feared God along with his whole household. He did many charitable deeds for the Jewish people and always prayed to God. About 3 p.m, he distinctly saw a vision, and an angel of God who came in and said to him, "Cornelius." Staring at him in awe, he said, "What is it, Lord?" The angel told him, "Your prayers and your acts of charity have ascended as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and call for Simon, who is also named Peter. He's lodging with Simon, a tanner whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, he called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier who was one of those who attended him. After explaining everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now it's interesting here because the book of Acts, of course, is a book about activity and action by both the Holy Spirit and also the apostles and the church, the early church that is. And here in chapter 10, we see a major transitioning is happening. That is, something that has been in place for thousands of years is now placed aside. And of course, this is something that we can all relate to because during this COVID-19 sequester and quarantine and the distancing and staying in and staying alive, we also are going through something very traumatic in our community, something that is upsetting the normal course of activity. And this is what is happening here in Acts chapter 10. Now notice how the chapter begins as Luke introduces us to a man that we've never heard of before. We're never going to hear about him again after Acts chapter 10, although I'm sure that he was used mightily of God in his life. But we're introduced to this man, and his name is Cornelius. And Luke informs us that Cornelius has this encounter, according to verse 3, with an angel of God who speaks to him. Again, he calls him by name, and we've talked a little bit about how personal the book of Acts is and how that God knows our name. He calls us by our name. He's very attached to our identity, and I just want to remind you that we do not serve a God who is impersonal. When God sees us, He calls us by name. He knows our name. And so the angel of the Lord, he comes to this man, Cornelius. The Bible tells us that he was devout, he was sincere, that Cornelius, that he feared God. He did many charitable deeds for the Jewish people. Luke informs us also that Cornelius always prayed to God. So he was a seeker. He was not, it's interesting, by the way, he was not at this time saved, but he was seeking God. And the Bible says this angel of the Lord, or the angel of God, comes to him. And notice what he says in verse 4, 5, and 6. The angel comes to him. He calls him by name, Cornelius. Cornelius says, "What is it, Lord?" And notice what the angel says, your prayers and your acts of charity have ascended as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and call for Simon, who is named Peter. He's lodging with Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea. So God commissions his angel, and he goes to Cornelius, a man that we really don't know a lot about. We've never heard about him before. We're not going to hear about him after Acts chapter 10, but he's a man that God chooses. He's going to be instrumental in ushering in this mighty transition that's going to occur. And there's something also that we see in verse 8 that Cornelius does as the angel of the Lord tells him to do. So much in our life hinges on our obedience to what the Lord wants us to do. As a matter of fact, we see, and it's pretty much a pattern in the book of Acts, that when God moves, that he moves according to the submissiveness and the obedience of God's people. And remember, the prophet so many years ago said, to obey is better than to sacrifice. And so it's very interesting as the story progresses, and we see that the transition now is gaining traction. It's gaining momentum as we continue into chapter 10 here, verses 9 through 16. We see that Peter has a vision. So we're fast forwarding now. We're going to the next day. We see in verse 9 through 16, if you'll read along with me, the next day as they were traveling and nearing the city, Peter went up to pray on the roof about noon. He became hungry and wanted to eat, but while they were preparing something, he fell into a trance. And he saw heaven opened, and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its four corners to the earth. In it were all four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth. There were birds of the sky, and a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter said, "for I have never eaten anything impure and ritually unclean." Again, a second time, the voice said to him, "What God has made clean, do not call impure." And this happened 3 times, and suddenly the object was taken up into heaven. So the day after Cornelius has his vision, then we see Peter has a vision. And it's a vision of a sheet coming down, and within this sheet are all four-footed animals and reptiles and birds and creeping creatures that are, by God's definition and by biblical definition according to the book of Leviticus and also the book of Deuteronomy, all of these creatures are unclean. Now in the Bible, there are 2 categories of animals that are considered appropriate or acceptable before God for his people to consume. So there were the clean flying animals, such as a chicken or a dove or a duck or a goose, and there's other clean flying animals. There were unclean flying animals: the albatross, the bat, the buzzard, the condor, and again several others, the woodpecker, the seagull, the stark, the swallow. These flying animals were unclean, and we have an image of the unclean and the clean animals here, but you'll see so there were clean and unclean flying animals. There were also clean and unclean insects. And this is very interesting because there are clean insects, according to the Bible, that were acceptable for human consumption. Locusts, of course, we know John the Baptist, he ate locusts and wild honey. And also crickets and grasshoppers, if you can imagine eating those. And then there were the unclean, which were insects without jointed and jumping legs. There are also clean land animals and unclean land animals. Some of the clean land animals, the antelope, the bison, cattle, caribou, deer, moose, reindeer, sheep, and then unclean animals, the coyote, the dog, the fox, the hyena, the jackal, the wolf. These are unclean animals. And then there are also clean water animals and unclean water animals. And so for 2,500 years, ever since the days of Moses, and Moses lived around 1500, 1400 BC, but since the time of Moses, there were distinct dietary restrictions that the Jewish people must adhere to. Now, there weren't just dietary restrictions for them, but there were also clothing restrictions. There were cultural and relationship restrictions. And for all of these centuries, thousands of years, according to God's divine plan, and of course, His plan, His purpose is always perfect, and it was perfect then, it's perfect now. But what we see in Acts chapter 10 is we see a transition, a major transition that begins with the angel of God speaking to Cornelius, and now Peter has this vision 3 times, the sheet let down, all of these unclean animals, 4-footed animals and reptiles, lizards, snakes, and things of that nature. And Peter is told, arise, Peter, kill and eat. Again, God calls Peter by name. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. And again, our God is not impersonal, and I want you to know that. And a name is so important. And again, I know I get off on this from time to time. Call people by their name. Don't just say, "Hey, how you doing?" or do everything in a greeting except call them by their name. When we don't call people by their name, it hurts their feelings. It makes them feel, for whatever, that they're not important to us enough to know their name. And so use their name. Call people by their name. The Lord did that with Cornelius, and He does it here also with the Apostle Peter. But notice that Peter argues in verse 14, I will never eat those unclean creatures, because I have never eaten anything impure or ritually unclean. But again, the voice says, back to Peter in verse 15, what God has made clean, do not call it impure. This happens 3 times, and suddenly the object is taken up into heaven. And so God is demonstrating by a visual and an audible object lesson. There's going to be major transition from Acts 10 on. Things would never be the same culturally, and the dietary restrictions, they had their place, and they had their place in biblical history, and certainly God knew what He was doing. He was preserving His people. But now there's this transition, and the insects and the flying animals and the land animals, that were considered unclean are now acceptable. And I hope that you'll get this, because we don't always handle transitions so well, do we? We get stuck in a rut, and we're used to doing things the same way, same time, same place, and we get in the habit of doing things. But COVID-19 has changed all that, and Acts chapter 10 changed things for the church and for God's people. So centuries of practice are now being placed aside. And Peter, of all people, will be the instrument that God uses. The same Peter that failed God, that lied and cursed and denied that he knew Jesus. 3 times he did that, and he went out and he wept bitterly. And we've talked about how that when Peter went out and wept bitterly, that became his credentials for ministry. How good is God that he takes us when we're at our worst and uses that to equip us for a meaningful ministry. So Peter will be the instrument that God uses. God gave Peter this object lesson of unclean animals. And now all of the designation, the dietary designation, the clothing designation, the relationship designation, all of those distinct things that for 2,500, maybe even 3,000 years had been practiced in the Jewish community, in the faith community. Now all of those things have been placed aside. And you see, God places things aside sometimes in His time, in His way, in His manner, of necessity for the furtherance of God's kingdom. And notice what God says. This is God speaking in verse 15. What God has made clean, do not call impure. It doesn't matter if you, for 3,000 years, you never touched it, you never ate it. God says, what I'm calling clean, don't call impure. So the story goes on in verses 17 through 20. It begins, if you notice verse 17 with me, while Peter was deeply perplexed about what the vision he had seen might mean, right away the men came who had been sent by Cornelius, having asked direction to Simon's house, stood at the gate. They called out asking Simon, who was also named Peter, if he was lodging there. And while Peter was thinking about the vision, notice how amazing God is. While Peter was thinking about the vision, don't ever underestimate your time of thinking and considering and weighing. Now, our thoughts aren't always in line with God's thoughts. I mean, there are times that we're way off base, but there are times where in our consideration, in our meditation, and I believe that's what Peter was doing here. He was meditating. He was thinking about the vision. God spoke to him and informed him. If you notice again, verse 19, 3 men are here looking for you. Get up, go downstairs, go with them with no doubts, because I have sent them. Notice verse 21. Then Peter went down to the men and said, here I am. I'm the one you're looking for. What is the reason that you're here? And they shared with him. If you notice in verse 22 and 23, they shared with them the vision that Cornelius had, how that he had sent them to go see Peter. And notice again, verse 23. Peter invited them in. He gave them lodging. And the next day, he got up and sent out with them, and some of the brethren from Joppa went with him. And so, just as Cornelius had obeyed the vision that he saw, he sent men to go and get Peter. Now we see Peter obeying what God told him to do. Now, Peter's going to go see Cornelius. Again, everything hinges on our obedience or our failure to obey. A few weeks ago, I talked about leaders. What do leaders do? And I know there's all kinds of good things out there about leaders and about leadership. But when it comes to a godly leader will obey God. Whether it makes sense to anybody else or not, even if it's going against history, if it's going against centuries of practice, a godly leader will do what God says to do. And Peter responds by obeying. And he comes to the house of Cornelius, and it's so interesting. Verse 24, the following day he entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. And when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshiped him. And again, such a powerful teaching here about Peter. Cornelius falls at the feet of Peter. But notice what Peter says in verse 26. He lifted him up, immediately. Peter doesn't even take a second or a moment or a nano moment to rejoice in this praise. He says, "You stand up. I myself am also a man." I'm a man. I'm just a man, just like you. Peter was not interested in personal glory or recognition. All of that died the night he denied that he even knew the Lord 3 times, and he went out and he wept bitterly. All of that selfishness, that desire for notoriety, that desire to maybe have recognition and a name, all of that died. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why God used him so immensely and so wonderfully, because Peter was absolutely selfless, and he did not want any recognition or praise at all. But I must hurry on, because we get to the heart of the matter in verses 27 through 35. Peter and Cornelius now, they're comparing notes. And the notes basically say 3 things. This is the Mark Harrison translation. God is orchestrating. God is coordinating. God is working. Other people may not be aware. God is orchestrating, He is coordinating, He is working, and that's what God does. He orchestrates, He coordinates, and He works behind the scenes. He brings 2 people together, a Jew of high notoriety and a Gentile also of high notoriety, and He brings them together. He brings them together. And we see in verses 27 through 29, we see Peter's testimony. In verse 30 through 33, we see the testimony of Cornelius. And in verse 33, we see how God has orchestrated these events. And we see the climax here, or the bottom line, or the unifying theme of this passage. We see it in verse 34 and 35, and I hope that you'll notice it with me. It's so important. Peter began to speak. Now I truly understand that God doesn't show favoritism. God does not show favoritism, but in every nation the person who fears Him and does what is right is acceptable to Him. And what does that show you? That our God is impartial. He does not show favoritism. He does not show racial prejudice or ethnic prejudice or geographical prejudice. God doesn't show favoritism. It doesn't matter about our family. And although we have an appreciation for our history, our heritage, and things like that, and we ought to show appreciation for that, but when it comes to our standing with God, we're all on equal standing. All of us. And that's what Acts 10 is all about. The vision of the food, the unclean food, that is a literal vision, but it's also a symbolic vision, a highly symbolic vision, that all of those things that Peter stayed away from before, he said, no, I've never eaten that and I will never eat it. God says, get up and eat it. And so for people that don't look like me and they don't look like you, God says, go over there and talk to them. Treat them like a human. Realize that they have a soul, that they are a soul for whom Christ died. Now I truly understand that God doesn't show favoritism. And you know, Peter, he kind of trips up on this a little bit. And if you read the book of Galatians, Paul has to confront Peter on his dissimulation or his play acting, and he called Peter on the carpet. But Peter is instrumental here. Now I understand that God doesn't show favoritism, but in every nation the person who fears Him and does what is right is acceptable in Him and to Him. Which that leads us to verses 36 through 43. Because now here's Peter, and he and Cornelius already share a very special bond because they have both heard from the Lord. But remember, Cornelius is not even saved. He's devout. He prays. He's a seeker, but he's not even saved. And so Peter has the pleasure, the honor to lead Cornelius to Christ. And Cornelius is saved, and they are baptized. We read that in verses 44 through 48, and he talks about this. Verse 45: the circumcised believers who had come with Peter were amazed because the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles. For they heard them speaking in tongues and declaring the greatness of God. So not only was Cornelius saved that day, but there was all of the delegation that was there, and all of a sudden there at Caesarea, and Caesarea will become a center of Christian activity there for the early church, and it begins here with Cornelius and Peter. And we see that people are saved and people are baptized, and it all begins here with a vision to Cornelius and a vision to Peter, and the fact that they obey what God has told them to do. As a result, now the gospel is going to just really pick up traction in Asia Minor and Europe and the surrounding area because people are willing to hear from God. But they're also willing to obey Him. And what we see in conclusion is thousands of years of practice, thousands of years of distinction and designations as to what you can eat and what you can't eat, what you can wear and what you cannot wear, who you can associate with and who you cannot associate with. Centuries of practice, thousands of years of practice is now being set aside. Isn't that just like God? In His creative genius. In His divine foreknowledge, God is always on time. He orchestrates, He coordinates, He works when we don't realize that it's Him working. He brings people into our lives. I mean, what are the chances that Cornelius and Peter would ever meet aside from the intervention of God? And you see, that's just how God works. And when it's all said and done, oh, how we need this message. Even in the year 2020, God does not show favoritism. Red, yellow, black, or white, all are precious in His sight. It was true then, it's true now, and it will always be true. Thank you so much.